The modern history of black gold begins along the banks of a small river passing through Titusville, Pennsylvania, on the east coast of the United States. The presence of oil seeping from the ground there was so apparent that the river was known as Oil Creek, a name it still has today.
Well, in the initial early days, you know, oil seeps out of the ground in certain places. And so people would see oil scum on the top of a little river, and somebody would, in fact, in Burma, they collect this stuff off just little streams and rivers, and there are these indications that come out naturally. So in Pennsylvania, there were plenty of these seepages, as they're called. And in 1859 or something, Edwin Drake was the first man to drill the first well, deliberately to look for this oil. And he drilled to a depth of only 70 feet or so, and up came oil. And of course, as soon as this oil arrived, people could see it was valuable, and they could see it was here, so somebody drilled the next place. And really, within the span of about 5 years or so, people just saw where the oil was found and related it to the geological structures, which already there was the science of geology then. So they could see the relationship between these structures called anticlines, which is like an arch, like the rocks are folded and the oil collects at the top of the fold. And they began to observe this just in a practical way. And then once they found this structure with oil in it, they would follow it, and then they would look for another one. And really, within a few years of the first wells, the essence of looking for oil was already understood.
Employed by the Seneca Oil Company since the 1840s, Edwin Drake spent over a year experimenting with drilling at Oil Creek, before finally perfecting the technique in 1859.
Oil! 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 Oil!
The value of crude oil as a source of paraffin for use in lamps was already known at that time, but no one had found a technique for extracting enough oil to make the process a worthwhile commercial venture. Once Drake had perfected the technique, others simply copied his design, and an oil prospecting frenzy took hold of Pennsylvania. In just a few years, and despite the ravages of the 1860 to 1865 American Civil War, black gold fever spread across the country, as far west as California. At the same time, the conquest of the West was almost complete, aided greatly by the development of the Transcontinental Railway. Back in 1850, some decades before the dawn of the motor car, the demand for oil was already rapidly growing as a result of industrialization and the new railways. The need for lubricants, which had previously been derived from whale oil, was increasing. Intensive whaling had led to such a sharp decline in the whole population that a surge in whale oil prices ensued. Petroleum oil-based lubricants, which were not only cheaper but more efficient, became the obvious replacement, and probably saved the whale from almost certain extinction. At the same time, a revolution was occurring in the home, with paraffin lamps no longer a privilege for only the wealthy classes. The demand for paraffin oil became widespread throughout the world, and the American oil pioneers were only too happy to help. In the following years, derricks sprung up everywhere, in Oklahoma, Louisiana, Ohio, and Texas. According to a local paper, they formed such a dense forest that it was possible to move from one derrick to another without ever touching the ground. This proliferation was in part the result of a peculiarity in American law. In the United States, unlike most European countries, the land beneath the surface didn't belong to the state, but to the landowner. Thousands of landowners took advantage of this law and became prospectors of any piece of land they possessed. But as the United States flooded with oil, supply exceeded demand, and a collapse in the price of crude oil was likely. The situation was descending into chaos. Enter an ambitious 24-year-old man, John D. Rockefeller. He looked at the situation and saw an opportunity to make a fortune. It was once said that God created the world and Rockefeller put it in order. But Rockefeller's success wasn't only down to his visionary intuition and his ruthless energy, but also a complete disregard for the law. He told prospectors, "Risk your dollars to find new oil fields, and when you have found oil, you will have to ask me to transport it, refine it, and market it." It was on this foundation that in 1870, at the age of 31, he formed a company that was to become legendary, Standard Oil.
Le coup de génie de Rockefeller a été de standardiser la production de produits raffinés. Tout est dans le mot standard que l'on trouve dans le nom de son groupe, du groupe de l'Empire qu'il a créé. À partir du moment où l'on pouvait mettre sur le marché un produit ayant des normes, des spécifications standards, pouvant être utilisés par des gens très différents, la voie a été ouverte à l'utilisation à grande échelle du pétrole. Et en particulier par les voitures automobiles, puisque les deux industries se sont développées en parallèle à cette époque. Les automobiles avaient besoin d'un produit standard et le pétrole avait besoin d'un marché standard, en quelque sorte. Donc le coup de génie de Rockefeller est d'avoir vu, d'avoir perçu cette fenêtre d'opportunité et de l'avoir saisie.
From the outset, Rockefeller imposed his will on small landowners and swallowed up one competitor after another. And he used any means possible to achieve his goals: blackmail, bribery, industrial espionage, and violence. When he turned his attention to the pipeline owners and they resisted him, without a second thought, he sent his henchmen to sabotage their installations. In just a few years, Rockefeller had created an oil empire built on 70 companies now under the Standard Oil umbrella. Standard Oil became so successful that Rockefeller soon became deeply despised in the United States. In 1890, after considerable pressure from the press and struggling independent oil magnates, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first act in U.S. law to restrict the actions of monopolies and cartels. After a 20-year legal battle, Rockefeller would eventually be found guilty of violating that law, and the Supreme Court would demand that Standard Oil be divided into 34 competing companies. Some would become successful in their own right, but the legacy of Rockefeller's model of vertical integration would live on.
John D. Rockefeller entered the business soon after the discovery of oil at the Drake Well. He was an organizational genius and a very ruthless competitor, and that combination was what was needed in this early period. He looked in the industry and he saw chaos, and his accountant's mentality, his accountant's soul, convinced him that he was the one who could impose order on that chaos. Over about 30 years, he moved toward the model of vertical integration, connecting refining to transportation to marketing and finally oil production into the mix. And that did become the model for every major oil-related company in America for the next 50 to 75 years.
On the other side of the Atlantic, two European companies operating in Southeast Asia had been watching Rockefeller's model very closely. An Anglo-Dutch alliance bearing the symbol of a scallop shell was about to become the first competitor to challenge Standard Oil. Royal Dutch Shell was born from the meeting of two men